usually. But cell phone. Good morning. Good morning. I'd like to welcome back Ambassador Melvyn Levitsky of the International Narcotics Control Board. He's presenting in New York on the annual report of the board, a body which is an independent body which is working with the United Nations on narcotics control issues. I'm sure he'll explain the relation to you. He is Professor of International Policy and Practice and a senior fellow on at the International Policy Center of the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, University of Michigan. He's presented these reports several years here and will do so again today. Copies of the report are available. The main launch is being held, or I believe probably has been held already in Vienna, but under the same embargo. So we'll have a quick a briefing on the contents of the report, and then we'll be able to take questions. Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you for coming. It's good to be with you. So let me say just a couple of words about the INCB, just to put this in context for some of you who have not attended these briefings before. We are 13 members elected by the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, and 10 of us are nominated by governments. 3 of the 13 are nominated by the World Health Organization. They're typically scientists, pharmacologists, experts in psychiatry, in the more technical subjects. If we are elected after being nominated by governments, we serve in our individual capacities and our personal capacities as experts. We cannot have ties to the government, so the board is an impartial board. We're served by a secretariat which is financed by the United Nations, but it's an independent secretariat. Basically, our job is to monitor and promote measures by governments to carry out the provisions of the 3 drug control conventions, 1961, 1971, and 1988, with regard to both licit and illicit drugs and their use and abuse. We also have a special role with regard to precursor chemicals that are used to make drugs, particularly the illicit drugs, and we have a system of estimates that countries provide us with regarding their use of licit drugs in terms of the estimates, and then they report the use of drugs so that we can try to ensure that those licit drugs, therapeutic drugs, the good drugs are kept in balance, that there's enough supply, and also that governments are controlling the way they are used, as well as undertaking their obligations to prohibit the use of illicit drugs like marijuana, cocaine, heroin. We also are supposed to ensure that there is the availability of the drugs that are used for analgesic therapeutic purposes, and we communicate with governments in a private way. Our meetings are confidential because we have private communications with governments, and our annual report is, as you might expect, an annual report's done every year. It's supposed to report on how governments are carrying out their responsibilities. So I wanted to give you a sense just of the highlights of the report so we can have time for questions and hopefully good answers as well. So the first section of the report, we always do a chapter 1 on a specific area of drug control. Sometimes we've done this on prevention, we've done this on treatment issues, on crime in general. This year we decided, because it's such an important subject, to do it on the connection between corruption and drugs. They're quite obviously tied together and linked. The big drug trafficking organizations need to employ corruption to do their jobs properly, to get through national boundaries, to get their wares, their drugs into national jurisdictions. And so by employing corruption, graft, along with violence, those two go together, corruption and violence, bribes and violence go together. They are able to avoid law enforcement interdiction, eradication of drug crops, and such things as extradition to jurisdictions that want to prosecute them. There are conventions, of course, against crime, conventions against corruption as well that a number of governments have signed on to, but still corruption plagues not only our area of drug control, but a number of areas as well. It weakens governments, weakens institutions, so that I hope you will have a chance to read it. It's quite a detailed report, and we make various recommendations regarding how we recommend that governments can deal with corruption, avoid it, or deal with it once it's employed by protecting judges, legislators, police officials, courts that are the objects of corrupt activities. And there are a number of recommendations, including internal affairs units that watch over this, including fair compensation for law enforcement officers and judges so that it wouldn't be a subject to bribes. But still, the money that is at disposable income of drug trafficking organizations often outpaces the ability of governments to deal with this and outpaces their own budgets. So it's a huge issue, and we have tried to make some recommendations for governments to deal with it. Some general issues that you would note in the report and in the press kit, we're concerned about the rise of synthetic drugs as well as designer drugs. Synthetic drugs, particularly with those that mimic effects of marijuana or cannabis, you've known under names like Spice, K2, they're advertised. They themselves are not controlled, and they are, since they're synthetic, they don't come from the marijuana plant, from the cannabis plant. And the designer drugs sometimes are marketed as something called bath salts. You might see on the internet something called Ivory Wave, different brand names. They are marketed as products, in the case of the synthetic drugs, as a kind of herbal essence product, and in bath salts as bath salts, but they are abused, smoked, injected in many cases, and in the case of designer drugs, where molecules have been manipulated to produce an illicit effect, in those cases, they are readily available. Some countries nations have tried to deal with them by banning whole categories. The trick to this is that the drug merchants in this case of these very powerful substances change the molecular structure so that if a government bans a particular drug, often the molecular structure can be altered and then that same drug that's banned is not dealt with. So we are encouraging governments, as some have done in the past, to ban have sort of a generic scheduling of these drugs so that they don't have to ban a drug each time a molecule is changed. We're also concerned in a general way about the abuse of prescription drugs. You know, in the United States here, this is now the second leading issue in terms of abuse of drugs. We have made a number of recommendations in this regard. So has the United States government. So have European governments, by the way. It's becoming, along with internet pharmacies, particularly illegal internet pharmacies where you can buy these things if you have access to a credit card or a PayPal, no matter what age you are, with a kind of phony prescription device that they use in the internet, can get access to very powerful drugs that are very dangerous, have killed, in some cases, have killed young people. This is something that is rising in terms of abuse. So as the control on the normal illicit drugs gets stronger, drug trafficking organizations, others, individuals, become attracted to using, to making money through the abuse of prescription drugs. We're also concerned about the creeping normalization of the use of marijuana, cannabis, decriminalization. We have problems with so-called medical marijuana, which has very little scientific basis to it, not in the conventions, but they contribute to abuse. For example, as the United States government has cited, there are 14 or 15 states now in the country that have so-called medical marijuana, and the government believes that the rise in, particularly among youth, in the use of illegal use of cannabis has to do with a perception that, well, if it's a medicine, then perhaps it can't hurt you or it's okay to take. And so we have seen a blip up in, for example, abuse of marijuana in the United States. Let me just, a couple of highlights, and then we'll open this for questions, of regional issues. In South America, we found that, in fact, production of Coca and eventually potential cocaine in Colombia has gone down, but we've seen a rise in Bolivia and Peru in the illegal cultivation of coca and manufacture of cocaine. There's also a new phenomenon, which is that labs have been discovered in some surrounding countries now, so that what is happening is the raw product is going into, for example, Argentina, which had a big bust recently, Venezuela, in some cases surrounding countries, Chile, for example. So it seems to be the drug traffickers are typically what we call squeezing the balloon. If they're pressed in one area, they squeeze the balloon, comes out in another area. This is obviously a matter of major concern for the surrounding countries to the three Andean countries that produce the raw product. In Central America, it's a major transit point. You'll notice in the report, if you've taken a look at the report of the press kit, that experts believe that, in fact, the income that is connected with the transit of drugs through Central America actually exceeds the legal economies in these countries, along with the violence and corruption that it brings, a matter of great concern. In North America, we've seen increases in drugs in the last couple of years, except for cocaine, which has been going down. We are concerned about the uncontrolled use of the so-called medical marijuana, prescription drugs, as I mentioned, and we are concerned about what is happening in Mexico. Since the cocaine market seems to be squeezed in the United States, it appears that much of the violence in Mexico, and its considerable violence, is due to fighting for what is essentially a smaller market. A lot of the drugs, the use of cocaine has gone up in Europe, which is another area. Europe now, by our reckoning, accounts for about 30% of the raw cocaine production. In the United States, about 40%, and then it's distributed in a variety of other areas. Obviously, in places like Russia, for example, where the abuse of heroin coming out of Afghanistan has produced a real epidemic in HIV/AIDS, particularly for injecting users. This is a matter of great concern as well. Let me note just briefly that we have a concern about Africa as a jump-off point for cocaine going into Europe. We have seen, for example, in places like the Gambia, the Equatorial Guinea, drug trafficking organizations getting a foothold so that they can catapult the drugs into Europe, which is now a larger market for cocaine coming out of South America. Southeast Asia, Burma, you know, was once the major producer of opium and heroin. It's gone down. Afghanistan is is probably 90% or more, is the origin of 90% or more of the heroin in the world. But we are now seeing a kind of blip up in Burma in terms of production, in Myanmar, and with rising abuse of that and amphetamine-type substances in that area, that is in Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. South Asia, we're concerned about the supply of these illegal internet pharmacies from sources in India and Bangladesh in particular. And finally, last comment I'll have is Afghanistan, which of course is a huge issue in which drugs are connected very closely with instability in the country, with violence, with terrorist groups, We have Afghanistan under certain procedures and a close watch. Obviously, we understand that it's related much more, the government is in a way crippled in terms of what it can do until it can restore, along with the help of its partners, the UN and NATO and other countries, restore stability to the area. But it is a real nexus of drugs, instability, and terror, and this is something that we're obviously quite concerned about. So, with that introduction, let me open the floor to questions.
Yes, thank you. Yes, sir, right here.
I wonder if you could expand on the links that you said exist between traditional suppliers of illegal drugs and these designer drugs that for the moment are still legal and are being sold on the internet. Is it the same people?
Well, this still has to be explored. It does not appear to be the same people in the sense of the big drug trafficking gangs that you would think of, what used to be called cartels. Cartels is a word that's a little bit passé now, because when the big cartels, for example, the cocaine cartels, were broken in Colombia, these big cartels morphed into smaller, more decentralized, cellular-like organizations. So essentially, it looks as if they may not be the same people running these things. Obviously, new methods are discovered now where you have worldwide access to the internet, and if you have, as I say, a credit card or a way of paying for drugs, there are, of course, let me make it clear, there are very legal and quite legitimate and very valuable internet pharmacies where you get licit drugs in a licit way with a valid prescription. If you go on internet and you will see the illicit pharmacies, basically what they have is a kind of phony prescription device where you have a consultation with a doctor, if he is a doctor in some way, and then you're able to buy these goods. So there is a chain where they have, obviously you have to have an advertisement, you have to be able to place an order, then you have to have a supply of the drugs, let's say Vicodin, OxyContin, a variety of other drugs, methadone in some cases, and then you have to have a delivery system. So there's a whole chain that has to be dealt with, and governments have to look at each element of that. A number of internet pharmacies have been closed down, but they can virtually set up shop on another site within a matter of minutes.
Yes, sir.
About, you've got a section on where you mentioned Canada, and
yeah.
It's a little surprising. You talk using words like significant when you talk about exports, marijuana and cannabis products and cocaine to a significant share of the US market, things like this. So is the Canadian government then losing, falling back on its efforts to combat drugs? You also talk about transit to third countries, other countries. Which countries?
Well, from the information we have, in fact, Canada and Mexico, let's keep this in perspective. The United States is the biggest market in the world. So there's an attraction for bringing drugs into the United States from other places. The United States does not have a supply of cocaine, so it has to come through other countries. Mexico has been the main route for transit of drugs for a number of years. But you know, for example, that particularly marijuana, that has various names in Canada, you know, BC Bud, this kind of thing. Strong marijuana, very high THC levels coming from Canada, from grow houses. Canadian government, the Royal Mounted Police have done a good job in doing this, but the market in the United States is a big one, and the border is a peaceful border which is relatively easy to penetrate, despite the controls at the checkpoints in the border. So Canada is both a supplier in terms of marijuana, although the United States, I have to say, is doing a pretty good job of supplying itself with the marijuana based on domestic supply. It's a matter of cooperative activity. It's certainly a professional effort on the part of the Canadians from what we can see, but it's a difficult problem, and it's a relentless problem. And let me mention the other border, Mexico. One thing I neglected to mention is there's a kind of two-way trade here. You think of guns and weapons coming from the United States going into Mexico, which fuel these various cartels, Mexican cartels, and stimulate the violence, and then the drugs coming up from Mexico into the what is a rather large U.S. market. So it is a, it is a never-ending struggle. The drug gangs do not, and drug traffickers do not just give up, and they find new routes for doing things. At one point, for example, the United States was supplied mostly through the Caribbean countries. Now it's basically Mexico, and Canada is not as major a supplier in that regard, but it's still, because of the long border we have, the United States has with Canada, a supplier of drugs to the U.S. market.
Let's go to this side. First, the young lady on the right.
From Japanese television, NHK, interested in the problem of designer drugs. That's cited in your press release also. Could you elaborate a little bit more as to what you found, especially in East Asia, including Japan, as to this designer drug? And can you elaborate a little bit more of your recommendation to governments as to how to deal with this problem?
Well, let me put it this way. This is a relatively new phenomenon, although the methods for doing this have been around for some time. I'm not a chemist, so I can't tell you exactly how the molecules are changed in designer drugs. But for example, let's take, and I'm not that familiar with the Japanese situation, but let's take what typically happens. That is a product, the so-called bath salts. We talk about designer drugs. If you put Ivory Wave into Google on the internet, you will see that it's advertised as a kind of bath salt, but it has enough words in there to indicate, in fact, that it's for something other than taking baths, but rather to abuse. And it produces an effect that in some cases, depending on how it's structured, these designer drugs, is like a stimulant, like cocaine or methamphetamine, for example. We have reports, as mentioned in our report, of deaths resulting from overdoses of these drugs. They're very powerful. And as I said, the problem is that they are designed as and advertised in a kind of technical way as something other than what they are. But the word gets around in drug markets as to what their effect is, what the stimulation is, and they essentially are bought and sold as drugs rather than as bath salts or as herbal essences in the case of the synthetic cannabinoids, those that are sold as herbal mixtures, but are really stimulate the effects of smoking marijuana.
Okay, let's go to this gentleman and after that, Matthew.
Mexican News Agency. You just mentioned about the dynamic of the trade in North America, the drug trade in North America, that it was a never-ending struggle. So do you consider in your recommendations the decriminalization of drugs, or at least the use of drugs as a solution to this problem? And my other question is, do you have any idea of how deep the influence of the drug cartels is in the governments of Central America and Mexico?
Okay. Good questions. Well, in terms of the influence, you know that there have been reported instances, and in fact a UN rapporteur who resigned after having been given the task of looking into the corruption in Guatemala, for example. So I don't want to presume to be a prosecutor in those countries, but it's pretty clear that corruption has been a big aspect of criminal life in these countries. One thing that we want to that we recommend very strongly is that corruption be criminalized. In some countries, it's looked on as in a somewhat different way than as a crime. As far as decriminalization of drugs is concerned, no, of course we can't, because the obligations under the convention are to criminalize drugs based on the lists, in other words, particularly the illicit drugs. Every country has an obligation to criminalize even possession, although the treaties do not say how, for example, possession of amounts of drugs are to be punished, if at all. The governments have flexibility in how they deal with the law enforcement aspect of this. So from our standpoint, you know, you can decriminalize, if you have a problem, any kind of problem, you can always, that's a crime, you can always decriminalize it. But I think most countries have come to the conclusion that that is not a proper solution to it. They have to deal with, along the whole triad of things, that is, in terms of prevention, in terms of law enforcement, education, prevention, education, law enforcement, treatment, which is the formula for dealing with drugs. And although it's hard, that's the essence of the obligations that countries have accepted. Remember, the concept of the drug conventions is that drugs should only be used for scientific and medical purposes, not for pleasure. Scientific and medical purposes. That's the concept that has, since the early 1900s, has been the guiding principle of drug control in the world.
Yes, Matthew.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to ask about what how things stand between the INCB and Bolivia. Bolivia has been asking to have coca chewing removed from the Convention on Narcotic Drugs. They say it's their right as indigenous people, and that this is sort of a. So I just wondered what do you make of that call, and they're obviously pretty critical of your stance on it, and what would be really the downside of something that people have done for thousands of years? Go ahead.
Well, the downside is that we're not a policy body. We are supposed to monitor the implementation of the convention, and under the conventions, Bolivia took on an obligation to basically to prohibit coca chewing, which they knew about when they signed the conventions. It has not been done. We have no enforcement mechanism for doing this. You know, Bolivia recently tried to. Bolivia always has the option of trying to get the conventions changed. It did try to do this. It did not succeed in doing this. So, as far as we're concerned, they're under the same obligations. The Bolivians under the same obligations. That's a matter of concern. We've made it clear. We've talked with the Bolivians. We've had Bolivian delegation coming to INCB meetings. They have explained their position. We have made it very clear that the INCB position is that coca chewing is illegal under the conventions, is against the provisions of the convention, and that's where this stands. The other thing that we're concerned about is not just that practice, but coca growth in general. Bolivia, as you know, has a large area of illegal coca. From their standpoint. From our standpoint, that, you know, legal and illegal, not as much of a distinction. But they also are a major producer of coca and an export of illegal coca to other countries as well. We've seen this, for example, and cocaine. We've seen this in Argentina, as I mentioned, and in some of the surrounding countries. So this is, that's, as I say, we are not a policy body. We are a body that is kind of like an impartial court in a way, and we've made our position clear. It's very clear in the report what our position on Bolivian coca is.
Okay, this lady here. Nick.
Yes, with Televisa, which is Mexican television, and again, we're highly concerned in Mexico of this rampant violence that has taken more than 30,000 lives since the war that President Calderon has undertaken 5 years ago. It's alarming that the more they fight it, the more deaths they are. Journalists cannot fight the drugs. News organizations are defeated. Cities in the border towns are taken over by the cartels. It seems like a helpless war in terms of conventional ways to fight the war. I wonder if in your report there is a recommendation to fight this war with the producers of guns. It seems to me that guns is the essence of this war that seems helpless.
Well, we are not. Remember, we're only obviously it's a broad question, it's a broad issue, and we're concerned about what the cause and effect of this violence obviously is. But there is, you know, a protocol to the International Crime Convention that has to do with small arms and arms trafficking, in some cases, rather large arms, in fact, that come out of the United States. Now, there is some conflict in the intelligence about where the guns actually come from. Obviously, the U.S. is one supplier, but there are other suppliers as well that these cartels have access to. They can buy a lot of guns, illegal weapons on the international market as well. President Calderon, as we have said in the report, took on these cartels. He took it on for reasons of obligation of the convention, but also for the sake of Mexico, as we understand it, to allow the cartels to basically have their own sovereignty in places where they exist is something that President Calderon, the Mexican government, said could not stand. So it's been a difficult struggle. We understand that, and a brave struggle, which is persisting. And obviously, you've pointed out, we say in our report something in the order of 28 to 30,000 deaths. How many of those are inter-cartel deaths? It's hard to imagine, but in any case, that's a very large number. So yes, I agree, it's a difficult struggle, but it's something that the Mexican government and the Mexican people have decided that is worthwhile taking on, as difficult as it might be.
Nick.
Just wondering, what's to account for the decline in cocaine consumption in the U.S.? Has there been a price spike, or is it just a shift to other drugs because of the decriminalization of marijuana, or some other effect?
Well, you know, the U.S. is a big drug market. It's hard to say what the cause is. We can only look at the effect. The fact that cocaine use, according to government figures, and the United States has a pretty good statistical measurement year by year has gone down. What we've seen is a rise in other drugs. We've seen a rise in prescription drugs. That could count for some part of this. Designer drugs, all the other drugs that are marketed. Price is a little bit harder to determine. There has been a spike in some area which might account for a lowering of usage, but there's plenty of cocaine around. Even though production of cocaine has gone down over the last few years, there's still a big excess on the market. So it's a little bit hard to say. Sometimes tastes change, sometimes the illegal market change. You know, there's a marketing device in this as well. Methamphetamine became a rather major drug in the U.S. market, some of which is produced domestically in the United States, some which comes from outside. So I can't give you a specific answer to that except for this mix that goes on, and it shifts and changes, and governments have to learn to cope with it. If you said 20 years ago, hey, United States government or Europe, you better watch out for this thing called the Internet, because your population that is an abusing population will have access to these drugs by going to a keyboard, people would say, wait a minute, you've got to be crazy. So the methods shift, the means shift. The drug cartels are very adaptable and flexible, in many cases more flexible than governments, because they don't have things like legislatures and courts and laws to have to contend with. And they can buy things on the open market. They can, so as I say, it's a never-ending struggle. It's always going to be around with us. We have made some inroads into it internationally, but we still have over 200 people internationally that, by figures, our figures and UNODC's figures, are abusing drugs. That's a rather large population. And if you think, one more point, if you think of gross criminal product in terms of what the income is from criminal activities, the World Bank has estimated this a few years ago as well over $1 trillion, with drugs being a major component of that. So that is if you think about what governments, there are only half a dozen governments or so that have $1 trillion gross domestic product. Gross criminal products are very large, giving the criminal organizations, including drug organizations, quite a bit of heft in the world. And as I say, in some cases, outpacing the ability of governments outspending governments in many areas, many cases.
You mentioned Russia, and one of the major problems, the spike of HIV infections due to the injection users, and that's related to the heroin from Afghanistan. But actually, this correlation exists for more than a decade. So can you tell more about, like, are there any later trends, like in 2009, 2010, in this process? And is actually the situation improving or actually deteriorating? And also related, can you make comparisons between the organized crime in Russia for drug distribution compared to some better known places like, say, Mexico?
Explain the last part of your question again.
Can you make comparisons for the role of the organized crime in Russia for drug distribution compared to some better known places like Mexico, say?
This would require a lecture that I would give to my class, really, to explain the whole thing, I think. But remember, we're talking about in Russia, so Russia since 1991, we're talking 20 years. And the early periods of transition in Russia, of course, many criminal organizations grew up, the so-called Russian mafia. And they became international because the borders opened as well, so they had ties to a number of countries, including the United States, Europe, Israel in some cases, and so they had tentacles out in a number of places. You're right. For example, there is you're Russian, I assume, so something called kompot, which is a kind of mixture of opium and a variety of other stimulants that have been taken intravenously in Russia over a number of years. What's happened now in Russia is that the percentage of new cases, as I understand it, of new cases of HIV/AIDS that can be attributed to intravenous drug injection, that percentage has gone down, so that you have a higher percentage now of unsafe sex transmissions in Russia. But that's almost natural because there's a large population that was first affected by perhaps intravenous using dirty needles, using the same needles, and now it's gone into the more general population. I can only tell you about the Russian government concern based on the statements that we have had access to that are public statements, expressing great concern about this flood of cheap heroin coming from, and opium in fact, coming out of Afghanistan. The Russian government has expressed its concern, has in fact criticized other governments, as we've seen it, for not doing more in Afghanistan. Those that have access and have relations with the Afghan government has expressed and has set up regional organizations among those countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union to try to deal with this as well. But there's a huge, remember, Afghanistan, although many provinces have been declared poppy-free, the big provinces in the area around the Helmand Valley, Kandahar, that area, are still not open to government control. So that as between terrorist organizations, the Taliban, the drug traffickers, some cases regional warlords, or drug lords as we might call them, the production is huge. Afghanistan is now producing at least 90% of all the available opiates, illegal opiates and heroin in the world. So coping with this because of the border and the border area and with all the various governments that used to be part of the Soviet Union is a tremendously difficult task for the Russian government. The organizations, well, this is, there are various reports. We don't have any particular insights into that in terms of what's going on in Russia proper. It's obvious that there is a big criminal activity going on as a result of the sale of drugs, but some of it also is fairly low level. And there's a certain production of, there's always been a production of opium in Russia as well, kind of a lower grade, not a production of heroin necessarily, but that goes into that mixture called kompot as well. So I'm sorry to sort of run on a little bit of this. It's a complicated issue. Obviously, it's a matter of great concern on the part of the Russian government because it's a health issue, it's a crime issue, has a lot of effect on stability and the ability of the government to exercise its own will within that country.
Okay, we're going to have to clear the podium for the noon briefing. Anything more? I think. Okay, one more question. We'll have to do it quick or else outside.
Concerning drug trafficking, what do you think local authorities can do to establish control in countries compromised by corruption, like in South America, the case of Brazil, where drug lords and police work so close together?
Well, first of all, it has. I'll just summarize what we say in our report. I think we have good recommendations. The situation first has to be assessed by the government. It has to become a serious issue, so there has to be political will on the part of the government. In some cases, I won't mention a particular country, but in some cases, if the government is compromised, then the political will goes down because there are officials within the government that are on somebody else's payroll, for example. Then there has to be a recognition that that corruption is a crime and a social and criminal ill that plagues society and stability. Then there are some measures that can be taken. For example, internal affairs units, that is a unit that's independent within police forces, within ministries of justice, within the court system, that stands apart and tries to judge independently the level of corruption and root out corruption, find out about it, and has a way of bringing it to some kind of process that can deal with it. And then, as I said, wages. It's probably impossible for governments to compete with trafficking organizations in terms of the bribes. But if a decent salary is paid, and if training is done with police forces, with judicial officials, with law enforcement officials, a combination of those things at least can help stem the corruption. The real problem is that the amounts of money in the hands of organizations that need to corrupt officials in order to do their business is immense. So this is obviously a task, and it is not, by the way, confined to developing countries. It's everywhere. It's in the United States. We've seen cases in this in Europe, Canada, in Mexico, in Latin America, in Africa, in Oceania, in all areas of the world. It's an international phenomenon that has to be dealt with, and it has a direct relationship to our issue, which is control of drugs. So thank you all very much.
And thank you.